Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And that brings us to a title which has been designated by Criterion at spy number 1107. This is a work from 1969, and the filmmaker is Gordon Parks. And the name of the work is The Learning Tree. This is the work from 1969, and it is from that incredible Renaissance artist extraordinaire, Gordon Parks. Written for the screen by Gordon Parks, produced by Gordon Parks, directed by Gordon Parks, with music by Gordon Parks. And it is based upon his novel from earlier in the decade. And it stars, among others, in its really wonderful cast, Kyle Johnson and Alex Clark and Estelle Evans and others. This is the work, which is The Learning Tree. The plot or story structure of The Learning Tree, I think, would focus on, or a discussion of such would focus on, this character of Newt, this young boy who is growing up during this time. When you understand, it's 1920s rural Kansas. And here we have the backdrop of this community that he lives in, this small town, a rural community, very bucolic, and there is the various aspects of the community that are painted, for instance, with the cinematic brush of Gordon Parks. And that cinematic brush of Gordon Parks, I should add, also has a very deep linked aspect to the autobiographical. And we understand, especially when we examine the supplements of this Criterion release, we understand that many aspects that we see depicted in terms of the community, the various points that we see, the setting, the environment, the atmosphere, and indeed many of the plot points as well, could be said to have links very closely tied to Gordon Parks' own life, thus the autobiographical spirit, that runs deeply through this particular work, The Learning Tree. And so we can see Newt, the main character, this young boy, this young man. In fact, he is growing up in this particular time, in this particular environment. We can see, therefore, we can sense many aspects, perhaps, of the life of Gordon Parks himself. And so when we focus back on the story of Newt in the context of The Learning Tree, we understand that he's living in this community. He has a family. He has these very close relationships with with the close circle of his family members. In particular, the relationship with his mother is very important, Sarah. And so she provides a type of guidance and wisdom that is very much needed for the children, in particular for young Newt, who is, as I say, growing up. And part of that growing up story with this main character also involves his meeting with his friends, his close circle of friends, his meeting new people, finding love, making those discoveries about first love and mutual attraction. And also in that context, we also see the various, say, challenges or issues that arise or that have already arisen, and that face Newt, or the context in which Newt has to confront these challenges in terms of racial prejudice and in terms of race relations between, with the African American community that is very much part of this community. But there is, at the same time, and quite unfortunately, there are very intense, say, clashes. There are very intense confrontations that have a strong racist element to them. And a lot of that has to do with some of the very direct experiences of Newt himself. For example, we see his interactions with some of, not all, but some of the school teacher authority figures that he has in terms of his school life, in terms of his classroom activities. And we see how some teachers might be really putting Newt and other students down because of the color of their skin. Not all teachers, though, are like that, because we do also meet along the way, for instance, in the context of the school life, we do meet people in positions of authority and influence that also recognize the racial prejudice that does exist in certain quarters of this particular community. And they also, in that recognition, they understand this is a very, very terrible and unfair situation, and they try to do the best they can to remedy this particular situation, to change people's thinking, to protect against these attitudes of racial prejudice. And sometimes those acts against racial prejudice, sometimes they work, and sometimes those attitudes against racial prejudice, unfortunately, do not work. But those reactions, I should say, are expressed not just by the characters that Newt meets; they're also very much expressed by Newt himself. And there are moments where we see expressions of Newt's character, where he is a very noble young man. He is someone who believes in doing the right thing. And if he or maybe his friends are caught in some kind of act of, maybe there wasn't any it's true, significant, or deep harm intended, but perhaps some kind of damage did occur that was either his fault or the fault of him and his friends collectively. Still, he feels a sense of responsibility to the point that he wants to try to better the situation as possible and try to learn from certain situations these external, say, racial prejudicial ideas or attitudes against him and his friends and his family on the one hand, but also trying to maintain a sense of dignity and nobility and trying to make the right decision, especially or even though, or despite the fact that as he's growing up, sometimes making the right choice is not always the easiest thing and it's not always the clearest thing. And as we progress through the plot, we see that those choices indeed become more nuanced and indeed much more sensitive, and they have certain significant and perhaps even dire consequences no matter what decision is made. And so this is the idea of growing up, is it not? Things no longer are simple. Things no longer have that innocent sense of childhood. But as we grow up, we begin to realize, or we are forced to realize, those aspects of reality of our own situation and our own communities. And that is certainly the case for Newt. We also see this realization or growing up in the context, as I say, of his close circle of friends, Marcus in particular. And we see not just Newt's family, but also some of the other families that are nearby that also form part of this close-knit community. And I mentioned Marcus, and I also should mention his father, and also I should mention Arcella and her family and her situation as well, and her relationship with Newt and Marcus's relationship with Newt. These are childhood friends, and in the case of Arcella and Newt, there's this kind of a youthful romance in the air. But these friendships and these romances are put to the test quite intensely so, and quite abruptly so, with various external elements that are unfortunately still present in some aspects of this community. Again, the racism and the prejudicial attitudes against them that lead to very, very significant and maybe even tragic consequences. And this has to do, for instance, with, say, how the police authorities, how they interact with this particular crowd, what their interactions mean, and how those, say, moments of violence and clashes with criminal elements or seemingly criminal elements really form quite shocking moments and memories for these young children, Newt in particular, that will have echoes throughout the film, and indeed perhaps the implication being throughout their entire lives. And this also notion of the authoritarian figures in the form of the police and their actions, their violent actions in some very vividly portrayed and very directly portrayed moments of this film. These are also part of that experience of Newt growing up, and for better or for worse, in terms of the intensity and the tragic implications of everything that occurs. Again, these are all part of that fabric, that interweaving. That type of growing up aspect against which, or the backdrop, this is the backdrop against which Newt must make certain decisions, or he must try to find his way. And indeed, as he grows up, and I mentioned this earlier, as he gets older, and as certain things tend to exponentially develop or deteriorate depending on the particular situation. And despite the fact that there might be voices out there in the community that are progressive and that try to promote the sense of that type of equality, and a type of trying to prevent or stop these types of prejudicial attitudes from fomenting any further. That being said, sometimes it is not easy, and indeed there are many things that happen here with Newt that aren't easy, indeed, that are actually quite difficult. And it is a testament to his character that he can intuit this, or he can get a sense of this through the guidance of many positive forces in his life. I mentioned his mother. There are other community figures as well, but that relationship, his family relationship, is very key, or those relationships are very key. And he thus becomes the central figure who, in the end, must make very, very difficult decisions that, again, from his vantage point, he realizes have incredibly profound consequences for the people around him and also for himself. And so this is a drama. This is a film about characters growing up. This is a drama about a community. This is a drama about confronting racial prejudicial ideas or concepts or attitudes, racist attitudes. This is also a courtroom drama. This is also a family drama. This is also a type of a procedural, in a way. This is also a film about trying to combat those racist attitudes, and what is the most effective way of doing that. And maybe that that question doesn't yield answers quite so easily. And this is also something that is touched upon as well. Also, what is touched upon too is the way in which attitudes of hatred can be engendered, the feelings of hatred towards someone other than oneself. And sometimes this attitude of hatred, and I think this is touched upon so poetically and so profoundly in this film, sometimes these attitudes of hatred come about because the one that is doing the hating doesn't necessarily is not necessarily privy to all of the background details or context in which some kind of choice or consequence has occurred. One therefore is catching perhaps only part of the story, or part of the circumstance from one's own perspective, which may or may not be complete. It might not be necessarily revealing the whole story. If one were to know what the whole story is, what the whole set of circumstances are, maybe that hatred might not be engendered. It might be so. It might not be so. But the fact that not the whole story is understood, the context is not fully appreciated, means that it is very easy for certain characters to rely upon feelings of hatred and antagonistic attitudes, and even prejudicial attitudes against the other, rather than trying to make some kind of resolution about certain, or preservation about certain relationships. It might be said that maybe Newt is a character that attempts to try to figure out the best possible solution. But again, things are not always so easy, especially when we have human nature always coming to the fore, and that human nature leads to decisions based on such human nature, and oftentimes those decisions are are affected by one's feelings of prejudice or hatred. And especially when that combination occurs, then we see the combination of those attitudes plus decision making equaling or leading to physical actions, and what those physical actions lead to and what they end up becoming, and what the consequences are in the short term and the long term. And in that span of things, at the same time, we have the story of Newt growing up in this community. So it becomes a very intense drama. It is also a very heartwarming tale, which is, as I say, telling the story of youth and discovery and beauty and nature and family. So it is a complex weaving of many tales, many stories being told, and I think that is a testament to the wonderful balancing that Gordon Parks and company are able to achieve, and the wonderful photography. The director of photography is Bernard Guffey here, very famous, known perhaps for his work for the films From Here to Eternity and Bonnie and Clyde, and his photographic eye, together with Gordon Parks' direction, really adds the sense of the bucolic and the nature and the natural, and the beauty of sunsets, and the beauty of the creeks and the rivers, and that feeling of freedom. But at the same time, there is a sense of the sinister, and there's a sense that sometimes violence might erupt at just a given notice, just out of nowhere, or these attitudes might emerge. And it's up to people like Newt and others who represent a type of positive force, positive forces in this film. It's up to Newt and others to try to understand what those are, try to confront them to the best of their ability, and to try to make certain decisions that hopefully will lead to will be some kind of expression of their moral judgment. It's not always easy, though. But again, that is again part of the multi-layering aspect, the very complex web of this in very powerful human drama from Gordon Parks. This is the work which is called The Learning Tree. The Criterion Collection has released this film, The Learning Tree, from 1969, at spy number 1107 on this Blu-ray edition, this new Blu-ray release. And it's purported to be based on a new 2K digital restoration of the work with uncompressed monaural soundtrack, and also with at aspect ratio of 2.35 to 1. So it, to my eyes and ears, I think it looks and sounds very fresh and very vivid. And so I can't say anything. I'm not an expert when it comes to any prior releases of this up to this current Criterion release. So I can't make any effective comparative and analytical comments here, unfortunately. But what I can say is from my own feelings and my own sense of my viewing perspective, as I watched this work many times, I could really get into it, and I feel like it was presented very well. The photography is one of the key aspects of this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with the supplements, but it is a very well presented work, and so I'm very happy that it's being presented here in this restoration version. And not only is it being presented in this wonderful release like so, but also, as with other Criterion Blu-rays or other Criterion physical media releases, we have a number of supplements that are part of the package. And this is another great, very densely packed set of supplements. So it's really wonderful to have this. So what are those supplements here? So the first supplement that's listed and that's included in the supplements menu is, it's called My Father Gordon Parks, and this is from 1968, and this is approximately 27 minutes. This is a type of maybe documentary, travelogues type of documentary, type of portrait of an artist, that artist being Gordon Parks. And that portrait is essentially being taken while Gordon Parks, the filmmaker, is making is on location in Fort Scott, Kansas, and um, how he is at work at he's very energetically so at work trying to make this film, which will end up becoming the cinematic version of The Learning Tree. And this is a portrait of the artist Gordon Parks from the perspective of his son, Gordon Parks Jr. And so we have a number of really interesting interviews that are included here with some very close family members, in fact, of Gordon Parks, including his son. We also see moments where we understand too Gordon Parks is a photographer. And so we see moments where we get glimpses of moments of the son, the photographer, taking some pictures and photographs of the set and his father, etc. It's a really, it's very very tender, and it's quite emotional to watch this, especially when we get a sense of the close family nature that is also being depicted here in this particular 1968 segment. And also we get comments from Gordon Parks himself about the Learning Tree, what it is, and about working with a number of the participants and the cast and crew. He recalls, for example, a lovely anecdote about the actor Estelle Evans, who plays Sarah, a very key role of Newt's mother. And he talks, Gordon Parks does, about the first meeting or the first, say, communication, or one of the earliest communications that occurred between the two of them in the form of a letter from the actor to Gordon Parks. And then they met much later. And then through that set of coincidence and communication, ultimately what happened was that Gordon Parks realized that this person could portray the character that, as I say, if we recall this idea of the autobiographical spirit of the work, this person represents Gordon Parks' own mother. And Newt is the character of Gordon Parks. And so if that's the case, then casting the character of Sarah is a very important thing from Gordon Parks' perspective. And so to get that type of anecdotal background with respect to the relationship, the professional relationship between Gordon Parks and Estelle Evans is really lovely. And that's one of the examples of some of the great anecdotal moments that really drive this particular segment forward. And again, from Gordon Parks' perspective, and also from Estelle Evans' perspective as well. It's really lovely. And also there's, speaking too of other collaborations made on this work, there's also some discussion about Burnett Guffey and the working relationship here between director of photography and the director, the writer-director. So there's a sense of that type of there's a collaboration spirit. There's also a sense of trusting the director of photography, but there's also a sense of respecting the vision of Gordon Parks, because ultimately Gordon Parks knows exactly what he's looking for, not only because he is the writer, producer, and director, but we are in the location where essentially grew up, and so he knows the locations. He knows exactly what places he needs to go, what angles that will perhaps one can interpret to be perspectives from his own memories, his own childhood. So I like this collaboration spirit between the director of photography and the director that's very evident on display, as expressed, for example, in this particular segment. So that's wonderful. And also, we understand too that Gordon Parks, has the eye of a cameraman himself. He is a photographer, and he is very famous for many things, many artistic endeavors: his music, his writings, and also his photography. And his photography is really quite bold and direct and important, and also very sensitive and very humane and very heartwarming. And we see some examples of that when we talk about the booklet, the really wonderful booklet that's part of this Criterion noise. We'll talk about that momentarily. And there's also very evident in some other supplements as well. But this type of still photography experience is something that I think is part of the reason why he gets so much respect, Gordon Parks does, from other people in the industry. For example, the director of photography, and especially too considering the fact that this is a type of industry, a Hollywood industry production, And while at the same time he is given, uh, Gordon Parks is given a certain degree of liberty in order to express this very personal story on these quite intense terms. I mean, there's some scenes that are very, very intense indeed. The fact that he's given this ability, this creative freedom to express this particular story that is also based on his writings or his novel. I think this is a really interesting set of circumstances indeed in the late 1960s that he was able to make this. And this is also very important too because it therefore becomes a type of a statement or a type of message. There is also mentioning of the fact that Gordon Parks tried to use his influence in terms of the creative powers that be in order to have as many African American members of the crew as possible, in order to be able to have this be a very important and significant production. As well as a reflection of this very intimate and personal and autobiographical tale, The Learning Tree. And so that is something that Gordon Parks brings up himself, and I think that's very significant indeed. But also, he the segment focuses in on some of the other main characters. For instance, Kyle Johnson, who of course plays the key role, the central role of Newt, and we get a sense of what it was or what it is that Gordon Parks maybe saw in him that made him want to cast this young man in this very pivotal and central role to begin with. And indeed, his performance is very tender. It's very much, it's also involving a lot of thinking and also a lot of decision making and a lot of pressure and also a lot of soul searching and also a lot of questions and not knowing the answers all the time and always trying to seek out what it is, what he must do, what is the right thing to do in this particular situation or that particular situation. And so there is a type of stoicism, a pensive stoicism, that is embodied so naturally in the actorly gifts that he obviously has here. And so it's a lovely performance, and it's in many ways it's a type of a pensive and contemplative performance that is also again reflective of the type of nobility and dignity that Newt has, especially in the face of some really tender moments, but also in the face of some really intense moments. So Kyle Johnson and the working relationship with Gordon Parks, I think, it's another great part of this segment. So My Father, Gordon Parks, from 1968. So please check it out if you can. It's totaling approximately 27 minutes. And that's not all, because continuing on with the supplements, we have a section which is called Revisiting the Learning Tree. And this is from 2021. So this is a Criterion Collection produced supplement, I understand, totaling approximately 29 minutes, in running time. And this is a conversation that is essentially editing certain interviews with contemporary artists and experts, Diane Archer and Ernest R. Dickerson, Nelson George, and Rhea L. Combs. And they are each talking about the life and career of Gordon Parks, especially or in particular the Learning Tree, and also talking about the context, the historical context in which Gordon Parks lived his life, and also he lived his career, and also the context in which he made the Learning Tree, and the state of, say, for instance, depictions, representations of African American characters and African American stories, or perhaps the lack thereof, in Hollywood cinema, or the limited representations, or limited stories, or limited amount of stories in Hollywood cinema leading up to the late 1960s and the time of the production and making of Gordon Parks' The Learning Tree. So that's one aspect here. At the same time, these, I think, filmmakers and experts, they also posit this notion about how Gordon Parks, in terms of his attitude, seems to be espousing the sense of integration. And this type of integration spirit is expressed not just in the story, The Learning Tree, in terms of the community and how the community is trying as a whole, on certain levels of the plot, as the community as a whole is trying to grapple with these various issues that are confronting all of them as a community in the form of racism and racial prejudice, and how that obviously affects race relations within the town. So that type of I think, broad leveled perspective, I think, expresses the hopes or the possibilities of a type of solutions to be found within the concept, or within the possibilities of integrations within communities, but also that's embedded in the story, but is also, I think, referred to in terms of, again, type of working environment that Gordon Parks wanted to achieve in terms of the production of the learning tree, and working with African American performers and crew members, but also working not just with African American crew members as well. So this brings to the fore his working relationship with the director of photography, for example, and it's a really fruitful and really productive relationship. And one of the great strengths of this film is the look. It has that, as I say, that bucolic, wonderful. It's a wonderful depiction of a type of beautifully realized rural America. Again, and it's set in rural Kansas in the 1920s, and so the photography is so much part of this, and it has this lovely, rich color to the leaves and the grass, and the colors of, say, the wood on the barns, or the cobwebs in the corners there, and when the storm comes, and things of that nature. And the color red too is also very significant, and it's brought up upon in terms. So when one sees the color red, if a character is wearing red, or if red is referred to, if it stands out, perhaps that is a type of foreshadowing, of some foreboding, if you will, that happens. And indeed, there are some intense moments that seem to occur sometime or another after the appearance, visually speaking, of the color red in some form or another. So that's a really interesting observation here. And also, these contemporary filmmakers and artists, in talking about Gordon Parks, they also make reference, of course, to the very important fact how Gordon Parks was a photographer, and how his photographs were one of their great strengths, of many great strengths, was that it seemed to be that he had this incredible talent and gift of being able, through his photography, to show or get a sense or give us, the viewers, the feeling of people thinking, of people feeling, of people realizing things, whether that be some kind of deep epiphany, or whether that be something to do with the day-to-day. And perhaps they are one and the same in the through the eyes of Gordon Parks. And if one takes this very astute remark that's mentioned in this conversation, and one can apply it to, say, the characters of the learning tree. I go back to the main character of Newt, Kyle Johnson's performance here. It really has this pensive, contemplative aspect to it that I think is very much indicative of the still photography talent of Gordon Parks, again, enabling us, the viewers or the watchers of these photographs, to get a sense of these people. They are human beings who are living and breathing and thinking and pondering and wondering and trying to decide certain things. That's Newt in many ways. That's many of the other characters too, in a lot of ways. And so that is, I think, a very profound set of comments here. And it's a really very well stated here in this. And they also make other references too, which are very apropos. Other comments about Gordon Parks' other works. The choice of weapons is referred to. In terms of decision making, each decision is different, and this reference to choice of weapons, and indeed the idea of decision making, comes up in another supplement or another interview with Gordon Parks that we will talk about a little bit later. This idea is so much directly linked to, as I say, the decision making aspect that we see on display when we were talking about our experiences watching these stories about these characters and the decisions that they have to make when everything becomes so much, when everything seems to be confronting them at a given moment's notice. So this is a very important aspect. I also love too the discussion here about the depiction of family life. There's the in the conversation here they bring up the idea of how Gordon Parks' learning tree is also very much a warm, tender, heartwarming type of depiction. We understand this too because there's an emotional resonance because we know how much the family means to Newt and to others, and this allows for another discussion here among these experts about depictions of family life, African American family life, the Midwestern experience too. And this is not a story that's set on one of the coasts of the United States, but it's a Midwestern setting. A 1920s rural Midwestern setting, and comment is made how stories like this weren't often depicted in Hollywood cinema, if indeed at all. And in fact, there's a really lovely reference that's made to Reverend S.S. Jones. And just to note here, anyone who's interested, we have spoken on this channel indeed about Reverend S.S. Jones' work that can be found, for example, in the great set which is called Pioneers of African American Cinema. And one of the films, or one of the excerpts, excuse me, that's included on one of the discs of that wonderful set, the Blu-ray set version, is indeed the Reverend S.S. Jones. It's called the Reverend S.S. Jones Home Movies, or these excerpt footage of these communities. And so this is a really interesting reference that's being made here, and I think that can help to parallel the storytelling that's going on with Newt and his family, and indeed the other parts of the other members of that community. And so this, and also talking about the family, the importance of the mother figure, and how this film seems to be dealing with the idea of representations or reinterpretation of representation, race representation, which I think is a very astute and brilliant and profound comment here. So overall, now this supplement, 29 minutes, it's so worth it. It is so thoughtful, thought-provoking, brilliantly discussed. So please check it out if you can. But that's not all, because next, the supplements include another recently produced discussion, a joint conversation with Hank Willis Thomas and Deborah Willis with Michael B. Gillespie. It's described as being from 2021. This is Gordon Parks, artist and activist, approximately 17 minutes. And so here we have Deborah Willis and Hank Willis Thomas talking about their own art, and also their interactions with, or Deborah Willis's, for instance, interactions with the work and art and photography of Gordon Parks, and how that really influenced her, and indeed how that also influences Hank Willis Thomas's own work and his own photography, and is focusing on this the exodusters leading up to, or linked very directly with, the story of Newt in 1920s Kansas, and also therefore the story of Gordon Parks in Fort Scott. So this focuses therefore in on the way in which Gordon Parks has essentially affected and influenced these two artists, and it's a very fascinating discussion. They do talk also about the idea of the storm and interpretations of maybe, or reinterpretations of what might be called cinematic myth, or myth that is that also finds form and expression in recent cinematic, almost mythical examples. The Wizard of Oz is mentioned here about that. Also, again, drawing reference, or drawing a type of creative inspirational spirit from the life, for example, the photography career, for instance, Life magazine photography career of Gordon Parks, etc. So this is and also how the art, their current art, or Hank Willis Thomas' current art, for example, and how the learning tree and Gordon Parks' photography writ large, how that is forming a very direct influence in terms of reinterpretation, and also bringing to the art world attention once again, the photography attention once again. Uh, Images from Gordon Parks, images from the Learning Tree, and how that is linked to history and the past, and also indeed the present. So, indeed, Gordon Parks's influence is still very strong and very potent and very powerful, even to this day. So, it's a wonderful conversation in that respect. So, please check it out if you can. Once again, it's approximately 17 minutes. And that's not all, because then the next section of the supplements is called documentaries. And here we have two documentaries that are described as having, or Gordon Parks had participated in, or was involved in, or had a very significant input in. And so we have the two documentaries here, and I'll get to those momentarily. Before we get to those, we also have an introduction to these documentary works, again from 1968. And this introduction is from Rhea L. Combs and Nelson George, who were two of the participants in an earlier supplement here, Revisiting the Learning Tree. That was also part of the supplements package here. And now it's approximately 8 minutes, this introduction. And here they're talking about the two documentaries, which is the Diary of a Harlem Family and The World of Piri Thomas, and both from 1968, and how they see those works as being very much a type of having a strong continuity with the photography career of Gordon Parks leading up to 1968 and 1969, and also his film career subsequent to 1968 and 1969. And there's also the sense of the genuine, and there's also the sense of trying to capture something of the human condition in these intimate details, and listening to the words and capturing the images and hearing the voices. And in particular, the Diary of a Harlem Family, we have this powerful use of still images and the spoken word, and it's combined in this incredibly thought-provoking way. But that's another example here. And they also do touch upon the fact that while Gordon Parks might not be credited as being the director of these documentaries, still he does have an undeniable, significant input and participation in these. To the extent that they can be discussed in the context of Gordon Parks's career. So it's a wonderful introduction to these works. And speaking of the works, then the supplements allow us to select one of these two, or these documentaries. So the first of the documentaries is, as I mentioned, 1968's Diary of a Harlem Family. This is approximately 20 minutes, and it's described as having photography and narration by Gordon Parks. This is incredibly powerful. It's very powerful because we have a brief introduction from Gordon Parks himself, and then it leads into the work, which is essentially photographs edited together with the narration, Gordon Parks' narration. And it's stunning. It's so deep. It's so raw and incredibly moving. And some of the shots, some of the images that capture the children's faces, or the way that people are looking out through a window and the light is shining through, and we hear the stories through the narration. Some very tender, sometimes very tragic and quite sad, and other times very moving and very touching. And this is, I think, a great example, a real brilliant example of the power of Gordon Parks's eye, and how it is so tender, and it's giving so much respect to the people who are the subjects of the photographs. And indeed, this is yet part of that echoing of the maybe one way to interpret the work of Gordon Parks, including up to the Learning Tree, which is his eye and the images that he, through his direction or through his direct involvement, his eye is capturing something of the human soul and people who are thinking and feeling. And that is certainly the case when we watch Diary of a Harlem Family. So it is so moving and very powerful and so well put together. So please check this out if you can. And then the second of these two documentaries is called The World of Piri Thomas. And this is totaling approximately 59 minutes, NET Journal. And we have focusing in on the Piri Thomas and his spoken word and his poetry and spoken word. Down These Mean Streets is referred to, and we have a number of really vividly captured moments in the community, outside on the streets or indoors with the subject in question, and talking again in very vivid, gritty, and direct and quite confrontational terms sometimes, in terms of the words and the images, about a number of these issues that people face, but also on a day-to-day level, how the world that is being portrayed here is filled with, again, thinking, feeling human beings. And that is always, always on display within this particular documentary. So this is another powerful work. I mentioned before, it's approximately 59 minutes, so just shy of 1 hour. It goes by so quickly, and it's, as I say, a very powerful and a meaningful experience indeed. So please check this out if you can. So those are the documentaries that can be discussed in the context of Gordon Parks' work. But that's not all, because the supplements do continue on with another segment, also described as being from 1968. This is referred to as The Movie Makers. It's totaling approximately 7 minutes. And here we have more discussion, more one-on-one interview, excerpt footage with Gordon Parks himself. Again, in Fort Scott, Kansas, where the location shooting took place for this film, The Learning Tree. And he's talking here again, he's so brilliant in terms of his ability to express himself, and he's very it's very easy to follow, and it's also so brilliant and so profound. So, for example, he talks about how, as he was growing up, how he too had a choice. He could choose the knife, he could choose the gun, or he could choose his talents. And I'm paraphrasing from a phrase that he uses early on in this interview. This is so powerful indeed, because, as he says, it's about the environment, it's also about the circumstances, the external negative forces, and how he could choose to internalize those negative forces in a negative way, or he could choose to combat those in a positive way. And the implication is that Gordon Parks now, as an artist, as a multi-talented artist, who is now, at the time of this, making what would become The Learning Tree, he chose the very, very latter. And thank goodness that he did so, because what he was able to create during his career is it's undeniably powerful, including The Learning Tree. So this is a very profound statement that he makes here. And also talking about his approach to The Learning Tree, he talks about he mentions, for instance, how it has helped me to fully recall the past. He's really maybe grappling with or dealing directly with his own past and his own childhood and his own memories, which is an incredibly profound statement to make, and it really indicates indicates the depth of the significance of many details here, and how it is very much, as I said earlier, it has that spirit of the autobiographical. So it's still telling a story, but there are also elements of the autobiographical here. He also mentions the importance that he placed as director to have as many African-American crew members as possible. And he also talks about returning to Fort Scott and working. He mentions how the community was very welcoming, and some people in the community actually make appearances in the film and the like. And so he does talk too about certain sequences, or there are certain sequences that are focused on. The storm sequence is referred to in this segment. Also the courtroom sequence, the courthouse sequence is referred to. Burnett Guffey is also mentioned as well. This is all From Here to Eternity, Bonnie and Clyde, and now The Learning Tree. And so this becomes another great glimpse into the genius mindset of Gordon Parks and Company. So The Movie Makers, 1968. So please check it out if you can. And then the supplements are they close with a trailer. It's approximately 4 minutes, but it's a very engaging trailer. So please check that out too if you can. Now let us focus in on the Blu-ray release itself, the design, as well as the booklet. It's a really fantastic, thick booklet with some key writing materials and photographs. So I'll get to that momentarily. First, I should mention this really great artwork depiction. Art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, designer Juan Miguel Marin. It's a very interesting. It has that sense of a sort of period nature about it. And I like this font use as well. It also has the echoes of the sort of period nature, which is very key too, because this is a film about a certain setting and memory and growing up, and so that feeling that feeling I think is also intertwined very effectively in this particular presentation here. And we should point out too, this booklet. It is a staple booklet. It is robust. It is thick. It is filled with great stills or images from the film itself. If you look here, you can see this is actually, for those who know the film, this is a really significant moment here, and it's expressed so well. And you open it up, and there are some further moments from the film. I should say too that the writings are really great. There is, first of all, there's the writing, which is, it's called From How It Feels to Be Black by Gordon Parks. And what this is it's a photo essay, which was described here as the following photo essay was originally published as the first half of a two-part feature in the August 16th, 1963 issue of Life magazine in connection with the publication of Gordon Parks's novel, The Learning Tree. And so what we have is this inclusion here of this particular article publication, and what it is the photographs. So these are the actual photographs. So it's a really interesting blend what's going on here. So we have a number of images from the film, The Learning Tree, and then what we get are Gordon Parks himself, and then what we get are some images of Gordon Parks's photography. Life magazine photography. And so that blend is so powerful, because what it means is it has a subliminal way of saying to us, the viewers, or making that connection about how The Learning Tree, the film, has that subliminal connection with the real life subjects of the photographs in question. So that is a very clever thing that's happening here. So I love this this inclusion and this layout and the way it's presented here. I should say too that this photo essay also includes, or the writings, the text are excerpts from the novel, The Learning Tree itself. So it's not the full novel, I understand. It's just excerpts. Well, I say just excerpts. Still having excerpts is incredibly valuable, and it has this. I mean, the way that things are written here, it has a type of style that is direct and easy to follow, and it's very vivid at the same time. And also you can recognize certain maybe moments that could be said to be reflected in some degree or another in the film that would appear later in the decade, at the tail end of the 60s. So it's great to have the photographs, the Life magazine photographs, and then to have these excerpts from the novel that, again, were part of this photo essay. So From How It Feels to Be Black. Really well done here. But that's not all in terms of what's written or what's included in the booklet, because then we have another Gordon Parks writing, which is Returning Home. And this is described as being in 2005, at age 93. Gordon Parks published the fourth of his memoirs, A Hungry Heart. He died the following year. In the excerpt that follows, which spans 2 chapters from the book, Parks recounts the fortuitous call that led to his semi-autobiographical 1963 novel, The Learning Tree, being turned into a motion picture. And so we have the essay here, and the call and the circumstances that led to that he recalls led to the creation of the film The Learning Tree. This is amazing. This is really amazing stuff, and it's so powerful. And again, the further reminding that it serves for me, and to remind me about how closely linked a lot of these aspects are in the learning tree to his own life. It's not wholly meant to be an autobiographical work, but the spirit of autobiographical spirit is there, or the semi-autobiographical, as the description here, I think the editorial description here describes it. I think is that's a really good way of putting it. So, but this is filled with a lot of rich detail and a lot of those circumstances, again, those real world industry circumstances and those creative voices, and the drive forward. It's all reflected here in Returning Home, Gordon Parks here. So it's wonderful to have these chapter excerpts as part of this booklet here. So we're getting a lot of Gordon Parks's comments, and a lot of his photography, and a lot of his writings. That's all connected to the learning tree, and that feeling and that atmosphere and the environment that is all depicted here, and how it's all connected to the learning tree, and also in return how the learning tree is connected to the life and times of the one, the only, the brilliant Gordon Parks. So this is great. This is great. Please, please, please check out the booklet. If and when you get the Blu-ray, and I've read through it a number of times. I still can't get enough of it. I'm just I'm overwhelmed by it. It's really quite something indeed. So well done, Criterion, for doing this. I should point out too that it seems that lately a number of releases are getting these robust staple booklets with a lot of pages and a lot of information that's printed there and also shown. So well done, Criterion. I hope this is something that will continue for most, if not all, the releases going forward, because this really makes a difference. It really does. So it's wonderful to have it as part of this package here for the Learning Tree. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.